I've just spent the last half hour filling in a feedback form for my visit to Tesco's. The young woman at the checkout gave me a card and said she'd be very grateful if I could do a feedback online for our visit to the shop. So that's what I've been doing for the last half hour. And the questions were, did I find the staff pleasant? Is the shop a safe place to shop? What about the quality of goods, the variety of goods? So many things to answer about what the experience was like. And they're obviously very keen to know whether or not customers are comfortable and are likely to come back. So I get that. And then next week we'll go to one of our favourite garden centres, and every time we go there now we have to book a table. And because they have all your contact details, they come back and ask, so how was your visit? How did we do? And so once again, it's about, was the service up to scratch? Was the selection of food good? What about the quality of the place? And so on. Sometimes preachers get feedback as well. Now, I'm not going to tell you what people say to me, but I have a couple of friends who years ago, one of them was a young student as I was, and coming out of a church, a woman said to him, "You'll be a great preacher, you stick in son, you're a scream." I also had another older friend who had preached on the travels in the wilderness of the people of God, Israel. And one of the older men in the church came up to him at the end and he said to him, "You know, I've been in the wilderness for 40 years myself, and you didn't do anything this morning to help me get out of it." Gee, that's a hard one. Sometimes it's hard when people appraise you, review your performance, give you feedback, whether that feedback is asked for or just volunteered. And sometimes it's another word for criticism. And you can feel when you get negative feedback pretty diminished by it and your self-esteem seems to be undermined. Now, supposing somebody somewhere was able to give us feedback on how so far we've been living our lives. How have we done with what we've been given? Our gifts, the circumstances of our lives, the resources that have been made available to us. How have we dealt with relationships in our family, the friendships that sometimes grow and become life friendships, and others that seem to fizzle out because that seems to be the natural way? What about the hopes and the goals of life? Have you fulfilled them? Are they still there? I quoted on Sunday one of my favourite lines, "In my youth I set my goal as far as I could see. I am nearer to it now. I've moved it nearer me." Feedback can be positive. So for example, if somebody praises you, that's feedback and it's good feedback. And sometimes another kind of feedback is when somebody acknowledges, and we acknowledge, that we haven't done very well in something, but they're prepared to help us to be better at what it was we were trying to do. And for that to happen, that makes us feel that we've been valued, that our company is wanted, and that somebody actually cares how our lives are turning out. Now that brings us, believe it or not, to the question of judgment and God's feedback on our lives. The words we've spoken, every one of them to be accounted for, so Jesus said. What about all those debts that rather than forgive them, we've clung on to them? Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. What about feedback there? And the vulnerable people who have been supported because we cared, the poor who have been given help because we've been generous, the sorrowing who've been comforted because we've gone out of our way to help folk. To be generous and giving rather than greedy and grasping. So if there was a form to be filled in about our lives, what would be put there alongside some of the big questions of life? Jesus told quite a long parable in Matthew chapter 25 about this. He talked about the sheep and the goats and the separation at the end of time of the sheep and the goats. And the ones who were given the positive feedback, this is what Jesus said. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I didn't have any clothes, you clothed me, and so on. And people scratched their heads and thought, but Lord, when did we see you like that and help you? And here's what Jesus said. This is feedback. As much as you did it to one of these, the least of my people, you did it for me. And so perhaps the most important feedback we'll ever get in our lives will be at that point when we stand before Christ and discover whether or not how we have lived our lives, how we've behaved, what we've done, whether the feedback that comes is positive feedback that acknowledges that when someone was struggling, we were there to help. When someone was being attacked, verbally, psychologically, or otherwise, we were there to defend them. It's a big question, this question of feedback, and I still think, even now, of that young woman giving me her card, knowing that whatever I wrote would matter to her career, her job, and her job satisfaction. So when it comes to how we live our lives, what about feedback? You know, probably the most important thing that might ever be said to us is said by God when he says, well done, good and faithful servant. Now that's feedback worth having. Thanks for sharing this time with us, and God bless you.